All right, so if you're watching this, you have probably heard about the war in Ukraine that's been raging for a couple of weeks now. Like, Russia invaded them from several directions. They've gotten bogged down. It hasn't gone super well for them. And part of the reason for that is because basically the entire world has united behind Ukraine and its right to national sovereignty. And a lot of people are talking about the sanctions that Russia has been under. You know, the United States, the European Union, and a lot of other places have just joined in economic sanctions against Russia, so they're just no longer trading with it in most capacities. And some of these sanctions are a little stupid, and they're done by private companies rather than countries themselves. Like, for example, Twitch and PayPal and OnlyFans are no longer paying out people in Russia, which is kind of stupid. I feel like that's not going to help anything one way or the other, and it's just going to hurt regular people. But that's kind of secondary to what I'm talking about. People keep talking about the sanctions, and some people keep saying it's horrible because it's affecting normal people, but it's not hurting Putin and his inner circle. And others are retorting and saying that, well, the idea is to make people so upset with Putin and his inner circle that they work to overthrow them or remove their support or something. And neither of those groups of people is quite correct, and it just annoys me, so I figured I'd just make this video talking about the sanctions and how they work and what they're intended to do. Because sure, part of it is that it's intended to pull support away from Putin and such, but really the main thing is that it is trying to destroy Russia's economic capability to wage war in the first place. Because modern wars are expensive. Okay, like I was doing some research before this, and I can't use Russian equipment for this example because it's harder to find numbers for them, but you can just easily apply this to other countries as well. So the U.S. military, an M1 Abrams tank costs about $9 million to build, and once it's out there in combat, it takes a lot of money to maintain it and to fill it with diesel. You know, filling it up, the tank with diesel once costs about $2,000 now, with the price of diesel as it is. You know, it goes up and down. All the ammunition it fires, it has a bunch of different types of rounds, which range from about $500 each to around $8,500 each. It's expensive. And then all the maintenance and repairs it has to go through, especially if it gets shot up or something, after combat, is very expensive. Each tank has a crew of 4 people, each of whom makes about $35,000 a year, and that's not even counting the costs of feeding and housing them while they're out in a war zone. So just operating one of these is stupid expensive. Multiply that by 6,000, you have all the M1 Abrams tanks that the United States military has, plus all the other different types of tanks, plus the thousands of jeeps and APCs and helicopters and jets and ships and boats and aircraft carriers, which cost about $13 billion each. A single Marine infantryman's equipment costs $17,500. However, the most recent data I was able to find on that was from 2007. So it's almost 15 years later now. That number is definitely higher, probably upwards of 20 grand. And then obviously you still have to pay the dude, and you pay them more if they're over in war. If they get injured, you have to pay for their medical care. If they get killed, you have to pay reparations to their family. And all of this isn't even counting what it costs to move this equipment around, like the logistics of it. This is expensive, okay? And so you need a robust economy in order to do that. And Russia's economy, to begin with, was not super robust, but now with all the sanctions and everything, it's been damaged even more. Their tax base has been damaged, their businesses are starting to shut down, and obviously this is making people angry with Putin, both his inner circle, who are losing money, and the regular Russian citizens, whose opinion doesn't really matter individually, but in aggregate they can cause damage if they really get on the same page. And so that's what the sanctions are for, really. It's about destroying Russia's economic capability to wage war. And if you want an older example of this, which is less pleasant than simply sanctioning them economically, you can look at the American Civil War and Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, if you're not familiar with that, basically, William Sherman was a general during the American Civil War, and he's most famous for his Georgia campaign in 1864 and 65, where basically he took his army and penetrated really, really deep into rebelling territory and captured the city of Atlanta. And Atlanta was a railroad hub at the time, which, keep in mind, trains were like the king of infrastructure at that point in time. They got a lot of things like troops and rifles and food and all that from place to place very quickly. And they destroyed a huge chunk of the city. Like, a big chunk of it was destroyed before the army got there, a chunk was destroyed during the fighting, and then they just burned down most of what was left, and rather than trying to occupy the city, they just kept going. And so while they marched from Atlanta to Georgia, or Atlanta to Savannah, which is Savannah's a port city, they just made a huge wath of destruction. They destroyed railroads, they destroyed farms and stole food and just destroyed regular roads. And some people will tell you that they just killed everyone in their path, and that's not true. Regular civilians and soldiers were only shot if they resisted this. And to be clear, a lot of these actions would be considered war crimes nowadays, but at the time, that's kind of just how war was waged. It's not pleasant, but that's how it was. And then once they got to Savannah, they destroyed that. They destroyed its ability to operate as a port. Then they turned north and continued doing the same thing to other cities and more infrastructure until the war ended. And so the whole purpose of this was partially psychological. Part of it was to scare the shit out of the rebelling soldiers and civilians and get them to give up the war. Just say, you know what, I'm done. I'm through with this. I'm finished. We're done. It's not worth the cost. And part of it was to destroy their economy, or more than it had already been destroyed because the rebelling states had been blockaded for years at this point. But the whole point of this was to make it so they could not make an army. Because in ancient and medieval societies, they could make armies, but they were super expensive, and so that's why if you won one battle, sometimes two, then you won the war, because you would destroy a chunk of their army and render them completely unable to fight, whereas modern nation states are a lot more resilient. My phone just went off. And that's the way in which William Sherman was a visionary. It wasn't in terms of tactics, because he was good at that, but he wasn't super visionary for the time. It was, he understood this. You destroy their economy and they can no longer make things like rifles or boots or food or clothes or anything else that soldiers need in order to fight. They can't, and they can't get their men to the places they need to fight either. You destroy all this and they cannot wage war in the first place, and they're forced to give up. And if you want a more recent example, you could look at terror bombing during World War II. The Allies did bomb the shit out of a lot of German and Japanese cities, sorry. And part of that was to destroy factories and stuff, but part of it was also to just scare the shit out of them. It's twofold. And so the economic sanctions on Russia, while they're not super pleasant, are still better than those options. And as long as I'm on this subject, I want to talk about why Russia's not doing so well in the war. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but basically dictatorships are just bad at fighting wars in the first place. Now, there's exceptions to this rule, and to all these rules I'm about to mention, certainly, but overall, more democratic countries are just better at fighting wars than dictatorships. And part of that is, like I was saying before, economic, because dictatorships are extremely corrupt and inefficient by nature, and so they tend to neglect their roads, they tend to neglect education, the money doesn't get where it's supposed to go. The Russian military budget is, I don't actually know what it is, but let's say it's $100 billion a year, and not all that money's going to get to where it needs to go. The defense minister is going to siphon some off, and then some of the other generals are going to siphon some off, and then other people going all the way down the line are going to siphon some off. And that goes for other parts of the government too, all the way from Vladimir Putin down to low-level bureaucrats and policemen. It's an extremely corrupt country, and all dictatorships are. That's just the way they operate. And so the money doesn't get where it needs to go, and that depresses the economy. And then in addition to that, you just have crappy education and crappy infrastructure and things like that. So the economy just doesn't work as good as it's supposed to, and they just have less of an ability to wage war. They can't pay for stuff. They can't pay for soldiers' equipment and everything. So that's part of the reason why dictatorships are bad at fighting wars. Another reason being competence. If you are just an officer who just graduated from Russian military academy, I actually don't know which ones they have, what they're called or anything, but say you're in the army, let's just as an example, and you want to rise all the way to the top and be like a top general or even the defense minister in charge of everything, it's more important that you're loyal to Putin than you're good at your job. And so while sometimes you get people who are both loyal to their leader and good at their job, a lot of times they're not. And so you wind up with incompetent people in positions of power, and they're just not good at fighting wars. And that's just what I was trying to get at here. The sanctions are meant to destroy Russia's capability to wage war while also killing as few people as possible. You can still maybe argue that they're immoral or something, but that is the point of them. You know, it's not just to punish people, or to punish regular Russian people. I think they're being punished enough by Putin as is, and a lot of the soldiers that are going into Ukraine are conscripts. They don't want to be there. In fact, there is a person who used to be on my Discord server who is actually from Sevastopol. He's from Crimea, and I know he was conscripted into the Russian army a while ago. And last I heard was from a mutual friend on Discord, and he's all right, but I hope he continues being all right. If you're watching this, you know who you are. I hope you don't commit any war crimes either, because the Russian military's been doing a lot of those, like shelling civilian areas, raping a bunch of Ukrainian women, but I mean, that happens in every war, really. Like, if anyone ever tells you during a war or an occupation, or hell, even just having military bases in that area, that there aren't a shitload of sexual assaults going on, they're wrong. They're lying to you. It is constant, and that's just one of the many reasons why we shouldn't be having wars like this, you know. Might sound kind of sappy, might sound like a big old hippie yippee dip or something like that, but we should not have wars. If you're ever in a country, whether you're American or French or wherever, and your government starts talking about, hey, let's go to war with this place, I want you to just think back on this. You know, think back on all of the innocent Ukrainians who are dying. Think back about how all the Russians who were either conscripted or just joined up in the military for a steady paycheck, who are being forced into this against their will, and they're dying too. All the people who are, again, suffering under economic sanctions, being raped, anything like that. Like, this is the suffering that war gives, and you should just think about that next time and really consider whether or not it's worth the cost. Okay, and I hate to bring race into this, but we do have people just outright saying that, oh, this is the first war between civilized countries in a long time, even though there's been plenty of wars between other countries, but those other countries were not holding white people for the most part. And then you have other countries just outright welcoming Ukrainian refugees with open arms while they were pushing away other refugees. And just, you know, there is a racial component to this. Part of the reason people are so okay with wars a lot of the time is because it's just bombing brown people very far away who have a weird religion. But just, this is the kind of suffering that happens. So really consider this next time and see if it's worth it. And I did wind up getting off topic there a bit at the end, but I hope you all have a lovely day. Goodbye.